Have you noticed that some people are slowly disappearing from your life without anyone actually deciding to leave? No argument, no betrayal, no dramatic goodbye. One day, you realize you're simply talking less. You reply later. You stop making plans. You stop telling them everything. And then one night, you look at your phone and realize there are people you used to talk to every single day who now feel almost like strangers. But here's the part nobody talks about. Sometimes, you don't lose people because you did something wrong. Sometimes, you lose people because you're no longer the person they were used to. And that sounds simple, until it happens to you. Because when someone you've known for years suddenly says, "You're not the same anymore," you may secretly wonder, is that supposed to be a compliment or an accusation? And what if they're right? What if you really have changed? What if the version of you they loved, the funny one, the agreeable one, the always available one, the one who never complained, the one who always said yes, is slowly disappearing? Then here's the uncomfortable question. Who are you when you stop being that person? Carl Jung spent much of his psychological work exploring exactly this tension, the difference between the person we present to the world and the person we actually are underneath. And sometimes, the journey toward becoming yourself doesn't begin with finding more people. It begins with realizing how much of yourself you have been giving away just to keep the people around you comfortable. So if your circle has been getting smaller lately, if old friendships suddenly feel different, if you feel strangely disconnected from people you've known for years, don't leave this video thinking something is wrong with you. Because there may be another explanation. Maybe you're becoming more honest, and honesty has a strange way of changing relationships. The person everyone knew. Think about yourself 5 years ago, or even 2 years ago. Who were you? What did you tolerate? What did you pretend not to notice? Who did you try desperately to impress? How often did you say yes, when everything inside you wanted to say no? How many times did you laugh at something you didn't find funny, just because everyone else was laughing? How often did you stay quiet, because telling the truth might have changed the way someone saw you? Maybe you don't even remember doing it. That's because most of us don't consciously decide to create a false version of ourselves. We adapt. We learn. We watch what gets rewarded. We watch what gets punished. And slowly, we become good at being the person other people expect. Maybe you became the responsible one, the strong one, the funny one, the successful one, the calm one, the person everyone calls when they need help, the person who never needs help themselves. And at first, that identity can feel good. People appreciate you. People depend on you. People like you. But eventually, something strange happens. You stop simply playing the role, and you start believing the role is who you are. Carl Jung called this social face the persona. The persona isn't necessarily fake. It's the version of yourself that you present to the outside world, and everyone has one. You behave differently with your boss than you do with your closest friend. You behave differently at a family dinner than you do when you're completely alone. That's normal. The problem begins when you become so identified with your persona that you forget there is a person underneath it. Imagine an actor playing the same character for 20 years. Every day, same costume, same lines, same behavior, same expectations. And eventually, the actor walks off the stage, looks in the mirror, and realizes he doesn't know who he is without the character. That's what can happen psychologically. You become so good at being useful that you don't know what you're worth when nobody needs you. You become so good at being strong that asking for help feels like weakness. You become so good at being agreeable that having your own opinion makes you uncomfortable. You become so good at making everyone happy that you don't even know what would make you happy. And then, life changes. The moment you stop performing, maybe you experience a breakup. Maybe someone disappoints you. Maybe you spend months alone. Maybe you lose someone. Maybe you simply get tired. Not physically tired, psychologically tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of pretending. Tired of being available. Tired of carrying conversations you no longer care about. Tired of laughing when you don't feel like laughing. Tired of being the person everyone expects you to be. And one day, something inside you says, I don't want to do this anymore. So you start saying no, not aggressively, just honestly. No, I can't come. No, I don't agree. No, I don't want to do that. I need some time alone. And suddenly, people notice. The friend who is used to your constant availability asks, What's happened to you? The person who is used to you agreeing with everything calls you difficult. The people who are comfortable with your silence suddenly become uncomfortable with your honesty. And now you're confused. Because you didn't think you became cruel. You thought you became honest. So why does honesty feel like rejection to them? Here's something worth thinking about. Sometimes people aren't reacting to who you are becoming. They're reacting to the fact that you are no longer playing the role they became comfortable with. They knew how to deal with the old you. The old you said yes. The old you stayed quiet. The old you forgave quickly. The old you needed their approval. The old you was predictable. But now, you're becoming harder to control. Not because you're trying to control anyone, but because you're finally learning to control yourself. And that can change everything. When people say, "You've changed," think about how strange that sentence is. You've changed. Of course you have. You're supposed to. You are not the person you were at 15. You are not the person you were at 20. You are not even exactly the person you were last year. So why do we sometimes treat change as evidence that something went wrong? Maybe because other people's memories of us don't update as quickly as we do. Someone may still see the version of you who needed their approval. They may still expect you to react the same way. They may still expect you to tolerate the same behavior. And when you don't, they experience your growth as rejection. But ask yourself honestly, did you actually become a worse person? Or did you simply stop being convenient? That's an important distinction, because there is a huge difference between becoming selfish and finally having boundaries, between becoming cold and no longer begging to be understood, between becoming antisocial and becoming selective about who gets access to you. But there is another side to this, and this is where Jung's psychology becomes uncomfortable. Because becoming more self-aware doesn't just reveal other people's behavior, it reveals yours. The darker side of self-awareness. At first, self-awareness feels powerful. You start recognizing patterns. You notice manipulation. You notice emotional games. You notice insecurity. You notice people wearing masks. And suddenly, everything seems obvious. You think, I finally understand people. But be careful, because there is a trap here. The ego can turn psychological awareness into superiority. You start thinking, everyone is fake. Nobody understands me. People are shallow. I'm different from everyone. And eventually, you stop connecting with people, not because you're more evolved, but because you've created a new identity, a new persona. Except this one says, I'm more aware than everyone else. And that persona can be even harder to recognize because it feels intelligent, it feels deep, it feels like truth. But ask yourself, are you actually independent, or are you disappointed? Are you genuinely comfortable alone, or are you avoiding the possibility of being hurt? Are you selective, or are you afraid of intimacy? Are you protecting your peace, or are you protecting your wounds? These questions matter, because isolation can look like peace from the outside. You can stay in your room, stop answering messages, stop trusting people, stop making plans, and tell yourself, I just prefer my own company. Maybe you do, but maybe you are also afraid. And there's nothing shameful about that. The goal isn't to force yourself to be surrounded by people. The goal is to become honest enough to know why you are alone. Because solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. You can be lonely surrounded by people. Imagine this. You're sitting at a table with 6 people. Everyone is laughing. Someone tells a story. Someone is checking their phone. Someone is making plans for the weekend. You smile. You participate. You look completely normal. But inside, you feel completely alone. Have you ever experienced that? Being surrounded, but unseen. Talking, but not really saying anything. Laughing, without feeling happy. Someone knows your name. They know your job. They know where you live. They know your favorite movie. They know what you usually order at a restaurant. And yet, they have no idea what you've been thinking about at 3 a.m. They don't know what you're afraid of. They don't know what you're ashamed of. They don't know what you're secretly hoping for. And maybe you never gave them the opportunity to know. Because you've spent years becoming acceptable. You learned how to appear okay. You learned how to say, "I'm fine," even when you weren't. You learned how to make jokes about your pain. You learned how to change the subject when conversations became too personal. You learned how to hide. And Jung's concept of the shadow helps explain why this matters. The shadow contains parts of ourselves that we push away from our conscious identity. The anger you weren't allowed to express. The ambition you were taught to hide. The jealousy you don't want to admit. The vulnerability you associate with weakness. The need for recognition. The fear of rejection. The parts of yourself that didn't fit the image you wanted everyone to see. And here's the strange thing. What you refuse to acknowledge doesn't simply disappear. It waits. And sometimes, the more you try to appear perfect, the more power those hidden parts gain. When you start seeing yourself, this is one of the hardest stages of psychological growth. You begin noticing things about yourself that you don't like. You realize how much you want approval. You realize that sometimes your kindness is mixed with the desire to feel needed. You realize that sometimes you call someone arrogant because they possess a confidence you secretly wish you had. You realize that sometimes you criticize people for things you haven't accepted in yourself. And suddenly, the world becomes less simple. Before self-awareness, you could say, "They're the problem." Now you have to ask, what part of this is mine? That's a much harder question, because it's easy to analyze someone else. It's easy to identify their flaws. It's easy to diagnose their behavior from a distance. But what happens when you turn the same attention toward yourself? Maybe people keep crossing your boundaries, but have you actually communicated those boundaries? Maybe everyone takes advantage of you, but have you built your identity around being needed? Maybe nobody understands you, but how much of yourself do you actually allow people to see? Maybe you keep choosing emotionally unavailable people, but why does that pattern feel familiar? These questions can hurt, but they can also free you. Because the moment you stop seeing yourself as completely powerless, you regain the ability to change. And this is where your loneliness may begin to look different. Maybe it isn't only about the people who left. Maybe it's also about the distance between who you are and who you've been pretending to be. Why your circle gets smaller. Eventually, something changes in the questions you ask. You stop asking, "How many people like me?" and start asking, "Who can I actually be myself around?" That's a completely different question, because suddenly, quantity doesn't impress you anymore. You don't need 20 conversations. You want one conversation that means something. You don't need people who are always available. You want people who are actually present. You don't want to constantly prove your value. You want relationships where you can be quiet and still feel accepted. You want someone you don't have to impress, someone you don't have to chase, someone you don't have to become smaller for. And yes, When your standards for connection change, your circle can become smaller. You might look at your phone and realize there are fewer people you would genuinely call at 2 in the morning. You might remember when your weekends were full. Now Saturday night is quiet. At first, that silence can feel like failure. You think, I'm losing everyone. But ask yourself, what if you're not only losing people? What if you're losing relationships that depended on an older version of you? What if some of the silence is actually space? Space to think, space to breathe, space to discover what you actually want. Because when every moment of your life is filled with noise, you never get to hear yourself. Solitude is not the enemy. Loneliness says, I wish someone were here. Solitude eventually says, I'm okay being here. From the outside, they can look identical. Someone sitting alone in a room. But internally, they can be completely different experiences. One person is desperately trying to escape themselves. The other is finally learning how to sit with themselves. And maybe you've experienced both. You've been alone and felt peaceful. You've also been alone and felt like the silence was crushing you. Why? Because when you're alone, there is nowhere to hide, no conversation to distract you, no relationship to blame, no audience to impress, just you. And silence has a strange habit. It reveals what noise was covering. The relationship you know is over. The decision you've been postponing. The dream you keep pretending you don't want. The resentment you've never expressed. The fear you've buried under productivity. The question you've avoided for years. Is this actually the life I want? That's why solitude can hurt. But if you stay with it, something changes. You begin becoming familiar with yourself. And eventually, being alone stops feeling like punishment. It becomes information. You stop explaining yourself. Another strange thing happens as you become more secure. You explain yourself less, not because you don't care, but because you finally understand something. People are allowed to misunderstand you. You can explain your intentions perfectly, and someone may still choose to interpret them differently. You can make the right decision for your life, and someone can still call you selfish. You can say no, and someone can still call you cold. You can change, and someone can still say, you've changed for the worse. At some point, you have to ask, who gets to define you? If everyone around you gets a vote, your identity will always be unstable. One person's approval makes you feel valuable. Another person's criticism destroys you. One relationship makes you feel worthy. Another makes you question everything. And your emotional state becomes dependent on the reactions of other people. That's not freedom. That's performance. Jung's deeper psychological journey points towards something different. Your center has to move inward. You can listen to people, learn from them, love them, care about them, but you cannot build your entire identity from their reactions, because the moment your identity depends entirely on how others see you, you become trapped inside their expectations. Maybe you didn't lose them, so if this has been happening to you, don't immediately panic. Don't immediately chase everyone who leaves. Don't immediately assume they're bad. And don't immediately assume you're broken. Instead, pause. Look at the relationship. Look at yourself. Ask, what changed? Did you become cruel, or did you become honest? Did you stop caring, or did you stop overgiving? Did you become selfish, or did you finally realize that your needs matter too? Did you push everyone away, or did you stop chasing people who were already walking away? There is a difference, a very important one, but there is also something you must be careful about. Don't romanticize loneliness. Don't turn your pain into an identity. Don't become addicted to saying, nobody understands me. Because that story can become another prison. You start believing that being misunderstood makes you special, that being alone makes you superior, that needing nobody makes you strong. But real individuation isn't about becoming superior. It's about becoming whole. That means being strong enough to be alone, and open enough to connect. Having boundaries, without building walls. Seeing people's flaws, without turning them into villains. Understanding your own darkness, without becoming consumed by it. And knowing yourself, without believing you know everything. That's much harder than becoming a loner. The people who stay, and here's the beautiful part, when you stop performing, the right relationships can become deeper, because now, people aren't connecting with the version of you designed to be liked. They're meeting you, the imperfect you, the uncertain you, the quiet you, the ambitious you, the emotional you, the complicated you. And something else happens. You begin giving other people permission to be real too. They don't have to perform for you. They don't have to pretend they're okay. They don't have to impress you. They can be tired. They can be afraid. They can disagree with you. They can change. And you don't immediately interpret their change as betrayal. That's when connection becomes real. Not because two perfect people found each other, but because two imperfect people stopped pretending. Maybe that's the relationship you've actually been looking for, not someone who constantly validates your persona, but someone who can see behind it. Someone you don't have to impress. Someone you don't have to chase. Someone you don't have to become smaller for. Someone you can sit beside, without needing to fill every second with conversation. Because when you become comfortable enough with yourself, you stop asking other people to rescue you from your own existence. You can love someone without needing to possess them. You can miss someone without collapsing. You can let someone leave without deciding that you are worthless. And you can let someone stay without turning them into your entire identity. That's a different kind of connection, a more mature one. Who are you without the role? Now I want you to think about something, not theoretically, personally. Who would you be if nobody needed you to be a certain version of yourself? If your parents couldn't be disappointed in you, who would you become? If your friends couldn't judge you, what would you say? If nobody could see your life, what would you actually want? If you didn't need anyone's approval, what decisions would you make differently? And perhaps the hardest question, who would you be if you stopped trying to be liked? Don't answer too quickly, because the answer may scare you. Maybe you'd leave a relationship. Maybe you'd change careers. Maybe you'd stop pretending to enjoy certain things. Maybe you'd finally admit that you're lonely. Maybe you'd stop talking to someone. Maybe you'd finally call someone you miss. Maybe you'd stop being the strong one. Maybe you'd ask for help. Maybe you'd start something you've been postponing for years. That's the strange thing about becoming yourself. Sometimes the person you discover underneath the persona is not who everyone expected you to be. And that's where growth becomes painful, because you may have to disappoint people, not intentionally, but simply by becoming honest. Don't hate your old self. There's another mistake people make. They discover a new version of themselves, and then start hating who they used to be. Don't. The old you had a reason. Maybe you needed approval because approval once made you feel safe. Maybe you stayed quiet because speaking up once created consequences. Maybe you became the strong one because nobody else was there to help. Maybe you learned to make everyone laugh because humor helped you survive difficult moments. Maybe you became agreeable because conflict frightened you. That person wasn't stupid. That person wasn't weak. That person was adapting. And perhaps the most compassionate thing you can do is look back at that version of yourself and say, I understand why you became this way. You don't have to hate your old self to outgrow it. You don't have to destroy the persona. You simply have to realize it was a role, not your entire identity. You are between two selves. Maybe that's why this period feels so strange. You're standing between two versions of yourself. The old one is familiar, but no longer fits. The new one feels authentic, but unfamiliar. And the space between them can feel incredibly lonely. You don't completely belong to the old world anymore, but you haven't fully arrived in the new one. So you feel lost. You feel distant. You feel like something is wrong. But don't mistake unfamiliarity for wrongness. A new life will always feel strange before it feels like home. Think about how every major transformation in your life probably felt confusing while it was happening. You couldn't see the final version. You could only feel the discomfort of leaving the old one. And maybe that's what you're experiencing now. Not the end of your social life, not proof that you're broken, but the uncomfortable space between who you were and who you're becoming. So, did you change? Maybe. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the version of you who said yes to everything needed to exist. Maybe the version of you who desperately wanted approval was simply trying to feel safe. Maybe the version of you who stayed in unhealthy relationships was terrified of being alone. Don't hate that person. That was you too. The goal isn't to become someone completely different. The goal is to become more honest about who you are, to understand your patterns, to recognize your shadow, to stop confusing your persona with your identity, and slowly, to make choices that actually belong to you. That's what growth can look like. Not becoming perfect, not becoming emotionless, not becoming someone who needs nobody, but becoming someone who can finally say, I know who I am, even when nobody approves. And maybe that's the freedom you've been looking for. The question you should really be asking. So if people have been leaving your life lately, maybe the question isn't, why am I losing people? Maybe the better question is, who am I becoming? Because there is a difference between losing people because you're pushing everyone away and losing people because you're finally refusing to abandon yourself. There is a difference between isolation and solitude, between arrogance and independence, between cynicism and discernment, between being difficult and having boundaries, and only you can honestly know which one you're experiencing. So listen carefully to your loneliness. Don't worship it. Don't fear it. Listen to it. What is it showing you? Which relationships feel alive? Which ones feel like obligations? Where are you pretending? Where are you asking for approval? Where are you afraid to be honest? Who do you become around certain people? And perhaps one of the hardest lessons of growing up is realizing love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes love means accepting that something has ended, without turning the other person into a monster, without turning yourself into a victim, without rewriting the entire past as a mistake. You can be grateful and still move on. You can miss someone and still choose yourself. Don't run back to the old you. So if you're standing in that strange period of your life right now, where your circle feels smaller, where old friendships don't feel the same, where you spend more time alone, where you're questioning who you even are, don't immediately run back to the old version of yourself just because it was familiar. Don't become agreeable again just to keep the peace. Don't become available to everyone just because you're afraid of being alone. Don't silence yourself just because honesty made someone uncomfortable. And don't abandon your growth simply because somebody misses the person you used to be. But also, don't use growth as an excuse to become cruel. Don't use boundaries as an excuse to punish people. Don't use self-awareness as an excuse to judge everyone. Don't use solitude as an excuse to avoid intimacy. Because the goal isn't to need nobody. The goal is to no longer need someone to tell you who you are. Maybe you didn't lose yourself, so if you've been losing people lately, maybe don't panic. Pause. Look at your relationships. Look at your patterns. Look at the person you've been pretending to be. And ask yourself, if I stopped trying to be liked, who would I become? Maybe some people would leave. Maybe some relationships would disappear. And yes, that would hurt. But perhaps some people would finally meet the real you. And perhaps, for the first time, you would meet yourself too. Because sometimes the hardest part of growing isn't becoming someone new. It's letting go of the person you became, just to be accepted. Sometimes the people you're afraid of losing are connected to a version of you that you're already outgrowing. That doesn't make them bad. It doesn't make you better. It simply means the relationship belonged to a chapter. And the chapter is ending. Let it hurt. Let yourself grieve. But don't run back to a version of yourself that you had to abandon just to keep someone else comfortable. Because there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. There is a difference between losing people and losing yourself. And if you have to choose between the two, choose yourself. Not because you don't need anyone, not because you're better than anyone, not because everyone else is fake, but because real connection should never require you to disappear. Maybe you didn't become colder. Maybe you became more honest. Maybe you didn't become antisocial. Maybe you became more selective. Maybe you didn't lose your ability to love. Maybe you finally stopped begging to be loved for a performance. And maybe you didn't lose yourself at all. Maybe, for the first time, you're finally finding yourself. And perhaps that's why some people are leaving. Not because you became someone they can't love, but because you stopped being someone you weren't. And maybe the people who are meant to stay won't need you to become that person again. They'll meet you where you are, not the mask, not the performance, not the persona. You.